Well, I have a confession to make. I saw this panel, I thought, ooh, is that one I want to do? And then the more I read, the more interested I got. Felt a bit sick doing my research. The average trip means that passengers generate each 1.43 kilograms of cabin waste, and a fifth of that is untouched food and drink. So there's a lot to be done here, and there's almost two separate issues. We have single-use plastics, and then we have catering waste, by which I mean sort of food and drink waste. And Paul, I know that you're very interested in the issue of catering waste, and you're really campaigning about it. But why don't we start with single-use plastic? Because it's a tricky one to tackle. How is KLM doing in trying to replace it?
Yeah, well, indeed, we've been working, I think, over 10 years in KLM to reduce the waste of our cabin, our catering products, and also on single-use plastic, we're taking quite a few steps. So we're reducing any plastic items on board that we can find, replacing plastic cutlery with wooden cutlery, for example, or even the packaging that we can replace plastic with napkins around rotable cutlery, for example, or reducing the plastic upstream with our suppliers. Actually, in the Netherlands, we've even stricter regulation coming up next year, so we're, as we speak, accelerating. The thing is, while we encounter time and again that reducing single plastic is super important. We're very dedicated and committed to it. It's not an isolated topic. So the moment we start working on reducing single-use plastics by replacing it with other materials, most likely we end up adding weight. And we all know that weight in aviation means additional fuel burn and therefore additional CO2 emissions. And that's where reducing single-use plastic conflicts with other interests, and that makes us lead to more nuanced choices than sometimes is allowed by regulation. So that's a bit of an issue we're encountering.
It's actually really hard in this sector to replace single-use plastic. Joe, pick up on that, because the great thing about plastic is it is hygienic, it is lightweight, it is cheap, it's versatile, and it is tricky to replace it. Why can't we replace all of it? And where do you see some solutions?
I think our background is obviously working in the hotel sector, and it's a lot easier to achieve it there because there's a static building, and it's that you don't have to take into consideration the fact that you're going to be traveling from one destination to another, or from one continent to another, where the regulations are completely different. So you can't just make easy switches, because what's allowed in one destination isn't necessarily going to be allowed in another. And as Paul was alluding to, the issue of weight, most of the alternatives to single-use plastic are, even if it's just slightly, but they are slightly heavier.
Like a glass?
A glass would be much heavier, but a can potentially might be just on par. But if you look at Tetra Pak water, so if you look at the bricks where you've got the paper carton, there's still a plastic lining in that. There's still a piece of aluminium in that. They're going to be slightly heavier. There's still challenges with recycling those as well. So I think everything has an impact. That's the thing. Whatever we do, whatever product we use, there's an impact somewhere in that supply chain. And not all the greener alternatives are as green as they seem when you look a little bit deeper into it. So we see quite a lot of plastic glasses, for example, would be replaced with a paper cup, but that's also lined with plastic. So they then become quite difficult to recycle, not necessarily because the technology isn't there, but it's not very economically important to do. There's no real economic benefit to that. But we are seeing things, new innovations coming out now with paper cups, for example, that have got an aqueous lining. And they could, where recycling is allowed from flights, they could go in with paper recycling. But then you've got, will they hold alcohol? Is the integrity there? So there's a lot of testing, there's a lot of things that need to be done to take the kind of work that we do in hotels and see if that practically is going to work in the airline industry.
And knowing you were coming here, I imagine on your flight over, you've been probably more aware of just how much single-use plastic there is. Has it surprised you, sort of looking more deeply at it?
Probably that I don't fly business class very often, and I flew business class this time to get here, so I saw a lot of different plastics that I don't generally tend to see. So little tiny salt and pepper pots that, even though they're really tiny, there's still too much in them. You can't use all of the content. Lots of different things that I wouldn't normally experience that I saw the contents of such as well, the small little olive oil bottles, for example, also going into the waste. So not just the packaging being waste, but a lot of the contents of that packaging being wasted as well. So I think, as Paul was saying, they've done a lot of work around food waste. If we're looking at food waste and being able to deal with that in a smarter way, we're also going to be tackling some of that packaging waste, because it's not going to be required if the food waste is being addressed as well. So I think there's a lot that can be done, but it needs to be taken as a holistic view. I think it's problematic, even despite the work we do, despite our name as Travel Without Plastic, it's problematic if you take a tunnel vision and only want to deal with single-use plastics. You've really got to take the whole holistic approach.
And Paul, let's tackle food waste, because you have been fighting a valiant battle, I would say, in trying to find a way that it can be better recycled. And part of the problem, I think, is regulation, particularly from the EU, which has become a bit of a gold standard, I suppose. Walk us through the challenge.
Yeah, so indeed, according to EU legislation, but actually legislation in many countries in the world, including US, big parts of Asia, entire Europe, force us to burn basically all catering waste originating from outside the EU on flights coming back. That amounts for KLM to more or less 14 tons of waste a day that we end up burning. We end up burning half-empty bottles of water. It totally makes no sense. If you take it on a larger scale for IATA, it results in 450,000 tons of waste burnt every year. Of which 40% could easily be recycled if legislation would be more nuanced. So that would be something we're looking for.
But what is it? What is it about food and drink waste? Why does it need to be incinerated?
Yeah, so it's driven by a regulation aimed at protecting animal welfare, so avoid spreading animal diseases. And actually, it's a good cause that we fully support, of course. We just feel that this legislation is disproportional and it's not effective. All evidence shows that the contamination risk from airline catering food, which is highly regulated and controlled, more than most other industries actually, the risk is extremely low, and most of the risks linked to aviation seems to be in animal products smuggled by passengers. So we would definitely propose more focus on that and more lenient legislation on burning cabin waste.
There's also a different rule within the EU and traveling from outside of the EU.
Yeah, so for KLM, all flights within the EU, we can fully recycle catering waste, and we do so to a high degree. We have our cabin attendants literally in the aisle separating all plastic from paper, from cups, etc., and that's fully recycled. We have, in the end, 13 different streams of waste that we recycle. But for all flights outside the EU, it's not allowed. We end up burning tons and tons of waste. And yeah, the sad thing about it, it's contradicting the EU's own aim to move to a circular economy. So it's
yeah. Given that push on the Green Deal, there seems to be an easy fix.
There's legislation hampering realizing the Green Deal for aviation, and well, the good news is that we are starting a dialogue with the European Commission through the cabinet of EVP Timmermans. So we're starting to have some traction, but I would definitely call on all the airlines here today to also join the lobby efforts towards your local governments, local authorities, and in the end join forces towards the EU, but towards the international community more broadly to get this legislation changed. And the thing with single-use plastic is that it will take years to reduce. It's very hard work. We need to do it, and there's a balance because of the weight that I mentioned. The good thing about cabin waste, if legislation would be changed tomorrow, we reduce climate impact as of tomorrow. So the impact is very immediate.
And it's interesting because there's more of a focus, I imagine, from governments when it comes to single-use plastic. I think over 100 countries have imposed various restrictions. Some have implemented total bans. But Joe, in some ways, that makes things harder because there's no harmonization of policy. And particularly for this sector, where you take off in one country and land in another, that's causing even more pain and difficulty.
Yeah, it's really, really difficult, and there's only limited space on an aircraft, so it's very, very difficult to be able to take whatever is allowed to be used and perhaps take waste home on the aircraft. So if it's a type of waste that's been generated on the aircraft and you can't, for whatever reason, recycle it or send it for disposal in that destination, is there enough space to bring that back, and what's the weight restriction on that as well?
And you don't want the emissions on the weight as well.
Exactly. So it's really complicated, but it is worth just pointing out, I think, based on what Paul was saying there from KLM's recycling, within Europe, not all airlines are actually recycling. So even though they could, there's quite a few airlines that I've travelled on in the past probably 2 or 3 months or so that aren't actually doing what KLM are doing in terms of separating waste on the aircraft. So I think there are still things that could be done straight away within Europe where that's allowed, if those processes were put in place to enable cabin staff to be able to do that now where they actually can.
I'm actually quite shocked to hear that airlines wouldn't separate waste at this stage, but do you think that's due to the fact that they almost certainly have to incinerate it at the other end? Or is this to do with there being no real policy for the sector on how to handle this?
I'm a bit sneaky when I fly, so I'll speak to everybody, in trying to find out what's going on. And it's mostly because either they're not asked to do it, or there's no process to do it. And because with being in Europe, it wouldn't have to actually go and be incinerated if it's a flight within Europe, for example. So plastic bottles and cans were all going in with food waste and just going into one black bag. And when I asked the crew what would be happening with that, they said, we don't know. We think it might get recycled by the waste collection company. We don't know. And that's been on more than one airline in the past few weeks. So I think people can really take a lead from what KLM are doing, and at least within the realms of possibility now and what's in the influence of an airline now, do that whilst the kind of parallel work is taking place on looking at aligning the regulations to allow this to happen globally.
Now, a fifth of cabin waste, I believe, is untouched food and drink. Is there a way to simply reduce that? I'm a traveller who generally says no to flight meals. I'm really sorry about that. I like to bring my own on board. I thought I might be reducing waste there, but I'm not. Is there a way, are there other methods to just reduce how much you are taking on the plane in the first place?
Yeah, there are definitely ways, and we're exploring quite a few ways. To give you an example, so we're in the process of trying to predict better and better how much food items or drink items, for that matter, are actually consumed on every flight. That's a big challenge to collect proper data on that. But for sure, that's a challenge in the coming years to have ultimately AI-driven prediction models that tell us, on which flight, how much food and how much beer, how much Coke is being consumed, and thereby adjusting the catering loading on a flight-specific way. So that definitely is the future. Personal choice, even pre-flight choices by passengers could definitely be part of the solution for the future. On short term, we're also testing other ways, which is, for example, on our European flights, we are testing right now with combining fresh food items with less perishable items to make sure that at the end of the day, we don't throw away any single food items and still have something to serve for the passengers on the last row of the aircraft, basically. So it's just an innovative way, small example of things we're testing out. We're trying to deal with reducing food waste, ultimately to zero. We have our own ambition of finally moving towards zero waste in the cabin. It's years away, but yeah, if you don't start with the first few steps, you will never get there. So
great application of AI as well. That sounds really interesting. Joe, I know you're working on a plastic replacement handbook. Can you give us any sneak peeks before publication?
Yes, so one of the things that we're going to look at potentially is not necessarily going straight to the word replacement, but looking at, are there any items that could be eliminated completely without needing to be replaced, like a drink stirrer in an orange juice, where maybe you don't really need it in an orange juice. We were talking before about the little salt and pepper pots, right? Okay, maybe they need to be replaced, and you could do that with a big pepper mill, in the business class. I don't know. There's going to be lots of different things that will be suggesting that will go out for review from hopefully with some of the people in the audience that will be able to come back and give us their insight on that. But what we're going to do is, at the same time as creating a document that will sort of push for this more aligned regulation, is provide some practical advice as what can airlines that want to and can actually do something, what order should they follow? So looking from a waste reduction hierarchy, what could be eliminated because we've just maybe used them out of habit or because it's become a brand standard, and that's obviously quite a difficult thing to get over. That getting through the sort of brand standard ceiling can be quite a challenge, and an exercise that we do with hotels and that potentially we can suggest to airlines is to look at brand standards and put, if somebody were to say to you today, right, completely rewrite the brand standard and put waste reduction at the very, very heart of it. And if we do this with hotels, we get loads of different ideas from different staff in different departments of what they could actually do. And then, of course, we have to look at, okay, how would that impact on cost? Is that actually available to us, etc.? But a lot of new ideas come up by putting waste reduction at the focus of a strategy. So we're going to do it in this waste hierarchy approach. What can we eliminate? What could potentially be switched to reusable or refillable options? What needs to happen for that to happen? What changes might need to be made? So looking at the pros and cons of each of those decisions, and then ultimately coming down to, if we're to replace single-use plastic with single-use something else, what are the things that you need to consider around that as well? So it's hopefully going to be there to allow the people that need to make procurement decisions to do that in a more informed way so that they can start to get that ball moving.
I mean, having fresh eyes on this and creating a document as you are, this would save airlines a lot of time and money, I imagine, because investigating different types of materials yourself, when this applies to the whole sector, would you like to see that sort of harmonization of policy?
Yeah, definitely. Airline business is per definition an international, if not a worldwide business, and yeah, we suffer from different legislations, uncertainty on legislation. We're still struggling to get the details of understanding, for example, the legislation on India on the single-use plastic. So it leads to uncertainty. It even leads, we know, with our caterers, to uncertainty as to where to invest in. We have caterers that hesitate to invest in plastic recycling because of uncertainty around the sub-regulation in different countries. They just don't oversee the impact of what's coming. So harmonization would definitely help in the coming years. And ultimately, for our aviation sector, it's the only way forward is to have a harmonized approach and to join forces as an industry on a global basis, definitely.
Do you think there is enough support within the sector and enough communication between airlines and governments to achieve what you want?
Well, there's definitely not enough. I would say there would be enough when we get this legislation adjusted and tailored to do what we need to do in a proper way. We do see a lot of good efforts, so we have good interaction with IATA on this. But again, I think we need more airlines to join in and to also locally lobby for the right regulations. So I think we could definitely step up the efforts.
Joe, you've worked more broadly in travel and tourism. What lessons can you bring to aviation?
Definitely collaboration. I think it stands out the whole time as being the number one thing that people have got to work on. So there's a massive, massive value chain around the travel and tourism industry when you look at all the different component parts of it put together, and everybody in that value chain has got a responsibility somewhere, whether it's plastic or other sustainability. So being able to do that together and each person playing their part and being a part of that jigsaw will help to complete the picture. So I think that's really number one. We see that there's a lot of innovation, particularly from private sector, but public sector infrastructure to support the innovation, for example, with new types of products, goes a lot more slowly than the private sector innovation. So trying to speed up public sector change and maybe have private sector talk more to governments and public sector, particularly waste infrastructure, to see how are these new products supposed to be disposed of responsibly so that they can be. But also, I think, being a critical friend to your own business. So being able to say, take a step back, and a bit like we were saying with the brand standards or how things have always been done, and accepting that for us to make the changes that we need to make in this day and age to really achieve what we need to do in terms of targets and climate change, we're going to have to make some changes, and they're going to be uncomfortable. So if you can step back and criticize your own business in a really productive and friendly way, and then implement those steps to go forward. And the hotels that we work with, the ones that we see that have great success, are the ones that are that critical friend and look to learn from others.
Paul, do you think we need to educate passengers more on how much waste is generated? Because you give us such a beautiful service, but I think if people were more aware of how much waste is going on behind it, you might also have greater pressure from that side.
Yeah, I think we could definitely educate our passengers better. We're as KLM also stepping up our efforts there. Again, it comes with the difficult trade-off that sometimes these plastics that even for a consumer lose...
The sick bag's hard to replace, that's what
Right, they look less sustainable, but ultimately they might be because of the fuel saving, and that's particularly difficult to explain to customers, we find.
Or they wave a plastic cup in your face and say, I don't want it.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. Then again, we get good, we're even separating the waste in our corridors. As I mentioned, we get a lot of positive response from our customers on that. So, but yes, it's the way forward. Ultimately, customers drive changes as well, and many of them are asking for it, and some others could be educated a bit more. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, that is all we have time for. Thank you very much. That was a really interesting discussion, and I hope we do see progress in this space.